Good afternoon. Welcome to Wake Forest University and this Voices of Our Time presentation, Why Work? Professions, Business Professions, and the Common Good. We have assembled a stellar group of individuals who will begin speaking this afternoon and continue through the day tomorrow. I'm sure that all of you will be prompted to think in new ways about the important issue of how we relate our personal value and commitment to the world of work. The purpose of this conference is twofold: to think about the conditions of modern business and professional life, and to challenge all of us to form more durable connections between who we are and what we believe on the one hand and how we work on the other. At this moment in American life, it is certainly timely to address these issues. American workers, particularly those who labor in professional vineyards, seem to be working more and more, but finding it less satisfying. In January of this year, an article in the New York Times spoke of the falling professions, depicting the frustrations of young lawyers and physicians. This coming fall, Professor Howard Gardner, distinguished psychologist at Harvard, will begin an experiment with several of his colleagues to teach a series of non-credit seminars to first-year students at Harvard called Meaningful Work in a Meaningful Life. Gardner's larger project, which is called Good Work, is driven by a deep concern that the quest for personal achievement is choking any larger sense of the common good. Those of us who work with young people know these pressures all too keenly. In all kinds of media, young people hear the persistent siren song, "Obey your thirst," "Broadcast yourself," "The power of you," "Purely you," "My style, my way." The only hope of fulfillment, the message goes, is to follow one's inner gyroscope wherever it leads. Obey your thirst. Who are you going to listen to? How about yourself? How do we address these trends, both within our culture and within business and the professions? And how do we renew the well springs of business and professional life? Wake Forest is honored to have such a distinguished group of leaders and scholars to take up these issues. For our keynote this afternoon, we welcome back to Wake Forest David Brooks, who last year delivered our commencement address and was awarded an honorary degree. David is an insightful voice on both political and social issues. On op-ed pages of the New York Times, he just told me that his deadline is in about an hour for this afternoon, but that the piece has already been sent in several best-selling books, and regularly on PBS's The NewsHour program. David observes our political and cultural landscape with a critical and a keen eye, and one that is wise. His thorough grounding in what is best in the liberal arts allows him to stand apart from much of the turbulence of contemporary culture and explain it as well as interpret it. And that's a very rare gift. His interpretations of modern politics and society, and even family and student life, are remarkably insightful. Joining Mr. Brooks on the stage after his presentation to pose some questions will be Steve Reinemund and Alex Sink, and I will introduce them at this time. David Brooks, welcome to Wake Forest.
I get a platform. Don't invite a Jew to speak at a tall podium. Brandeis, they don't need a platform. Okay, I've already started off on an off-color. Large amounts of squirming among the Christian community. That's First of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to be back here. I was literally having flashbacks walking through the same hallways I walked at before I gave that commencement address. There's this famous saying that there are no atheists in foxholes. I can't attest to the accuracy of that. There are no atheists before commencement addresses. The level of nervousness and applying for almighty guidance was very high with me as I walked through those hallways. And what I remember from that event most of all was the warm feelings that people at this university have for the place and the tremendous sense of emotional commitment. It's also a pleasure to be back here because I know that I'm no more than 5 miles away from Hillary Rodham Clinton, who is speaking, I gather, at a technical college nearby, starting in a little while. She's following me. That I could get away from her. As you know, that when Barack Obama speaks, I don't know if you've been to any rallies, I'm sure you will, as they campaign more in North Carolina, he's actually carried into the rallies by cherubs now, and the heavens open up with the Hallelujah chorus, sort of religious. She's more dogged and determined. She's brought in just by flanks of her highly paid staff who are all busy backstabbing each other. But it's a pleasure, and it's a pleasure also not to talk about politics for a little while and talk about something that's actually important in people's lives. And a conference, I guess that wasn't meant ironically. A conference on work, especially for college students, is something that I think is extremely important. I visit a lot of colleges, and sometimes when I speak to the students, I'm always struck by the fact that many of them think there are really two job options in the world. There's the noble but poor option of going to teach for America, and then the rich sellout option of going to work in investment banking. And basically, these are the two categories you have to choose from. I often tell them that I have a friend whose daughter is a Las Vegas casino fountain choreographer. If you've been to Vegas, you know there are these fountains with the lights going back and forth. She actually designs those fountains. She didn't go to college thinking she'd do that. But there are a zillion jobs out there of incredibly unpredictable nature, which most college students will fall into. And one thing we know about young people today, and especially those graduating from college, they do not make these decisions quickly. What we've seen over the last 10, 15 years is a creation of a new phase of life, a phase of people in their 20s wandering around looking for spouses and career fulfillment. Adulthood is 4 things: moving away from home, becoming financially independent, getting married, and having kids. In 1960, 70% of Americans had done these 4 things by age 30. Right now, fewer than 40% have done it by age 30. People are spending a lot of time in their 20s casting about, seeing what fits. As they do this, their parents go increasingly anxious about them. And yet, I think if you look at the results, it's natural when you have a group of young people who've grown up in highly structured lives, jumping through one hoop after another to get through college, and then enter a world of incredibly complicated job opportunities and absolutely no social rituals. You used to be able to date, maybe you'd have a fraternity pin pinned on you, and you'd get married quickly. Now all those social rituals have evaporated. Now you've got the amorphousness of Facebook, and then the amorphousness of the job world where you're not going to enter a corporation and be there for life. And so people are taking their time to figure it out. And it's a demanding period. I have a friend who says the United States is actually mediocre at educating people from 0 to 17. But from age 17 to 30, we're really good at it. And we take people and make them very productive and much more socially complicated beings. Now, as people enter the workforce and think about jobs, there's a conception that love is the romantic and emotional decision people make, and the search for a career is a cold and rational one. This is a dichotomy I think is completely false. One of the things we're learning is that all decision-making is emotional. There's a great scientist at University of Southern California named Antonio Damasio who had a student or a patient named Elliot. Elliot was successful in his career until he had a stroke. And after he'd had that stroke, he was unable to keep a job. He was unable to plan his day. He wasted his life savings on a terrible investment decision, and he got divorced. His decision-making process was totally blown. Damasio had conversations with Elliot to see what was wrong with the guy, and Damasio noticed he was incapable of processing emotion. He would show him pictures of dead bodies and earthquakes and horrible things. He had no emotion for those things. And out of that observation, Damasio and now many other scientists have discovered this theory, or this truth, which is emotions are how we value things, and that we assign subconsciously emotional values to different opportunities, and we follow those judgments the way we might follow a GPS system in a car. And if you make an unemotional judgment about something, you're making a faulty judgment. And as we decide about our jobs, what we're really deciding is, what am I emotionally committed to? And that was certainly the case for me. I was one of those lucky people who knew basically what he wanted to do by second grade. I knew I wanted to be a writer. It was not really a choice. It was something I enjoyed doing at second grade. I had the requisite qualities of certain verbal skills. I also had an aloofness, which is important in writers and especially in journalists. If you go to a sporting event and there are a group of people doing the Mexican wave, doing the wave around the stadium, and there's a group of people who are not standing up and not doing it, those people are journalists. If you go to a big rally, a convention, people are marching, they're cheering, they're excited. There are always a group of journalists with notebooks in their hands writing things down. It's that emotional detachment is just part of the profession. And so I knew I wanted to do that from a very early age. I recall in high school when women I was interested in would date other guys, and I would think, why is she dating him? I write much better than he does. I thought that was the ultimate reason anybody would be attractive. And so in your profession, and at least in my profession, there are two big sides of it. One is the craft side of the profession, the side that doesn't change no matter where you work. And for me, the job of writing is exactly the same as it was in college. My job essentially is I have a paper due every 3 days. And for college students, I'm going to have a paper due every 3 days for the rest of my life. And I do it exactly the same way. I carry around notebooks wherever I go. I write down things, my random thoughts or observations or things I've heard from other people on the notebooks. And then as I begin to write, I rip out the pages of the notebooks and I put them on the floor. And each pile of note pages corresponds to a paragraph of my story. And then I just write through the pages. Those of you who have written books know that most of book writing and even article writing is traffic management, knowing what goes in what order. And that craft of writing is something that hasn't changed. Hasn't changed, and it will never change for anybody who does writers. It's just something that's accomplished slowly over time. One of the people who study craftsmanship often say is it takes 10,000 hours to do anything well. Whether you're an athlete, whether you're an artist, whether you're a dancer, that's 3 hours a day, every day for 10 years. And that's an apprenticeship. And so that part hasn't changed. And those of us who are lucky enough to have figured out early what our craft is, it's sort of the great bedrock of one's life. The second part of work, and I'm going to get back to other people, but just in my own life, the second part of life, of my work, is where I'm working. Now, I had an incredible lucky break in my life, which I've described recently. I was in college. I wrote a parody making fun of William F. Buckley for being a name dropper and sort of a pompous blowhard. He came to campus in a setting not unlike this one, and he said, well, I was in college, David Brooks, if you're in the audience, I want to give you a job. And that was the big break of my life. And I actually wasn't in the audience. I was actually, well, that's another longer story. So one of the things you do, I knew I wanted to be a writer of some sort, and people have a sense of what their skills set is, and they know essentially what they want to do, but they don't know exactly how they're going to do it. And so I just went through my own odyssey years of trying on different things. I was a city news reporter in the south side of Chicago covering rapes and murders, learning things you would never learn in a university. I learned my first day on the job what a bacon and egg story was. A guy had raped his 13-year-old retarded daughter and thrown her out a window, and I was told to go cover that story. The experienced reporters looked around and said, "Don't cover that, that's a bacon and egg story." I didn't know what they were talking about. I wrote up the story, I reported it out, and I sent it in, and it got published nowhere. They told me the next day that people read the newspaper over their breakfast tables. No one wants to read that story over their bacon and eggs. And you learn how professions work in this haphazard way. The second day on the job, I was asked, a kid had committed suicide. I was asked to interview all the neighbors. A mid-level city official was killed in a car crash. I had to get a quote out of his wife. Ever since that day, I've had trouble taking the phrase journalistic ethics entirely seriously. You learn about the compromises that are entailed in professions. Finally, a couple of years later, I called up Buckley and said, "Is that job offer still open?" And what you learned from him was his intense capacity for friendship. He takes people at age 22 or 23, he invited us out yachting, he asks your opinion, he showers you with affection for a year. And that was part of his mentoring. And there are thousands of us who were launched on their skills, on their careers by him and by that intense interest that he had in young people. But then he sends you out and you're still casting about. And careers don't happen in any organized way. They happen haphazardly. I became a movie critic. I unfortunately became a movie critic exactly at the time the Brat Pack movies came out. If you remember the Breakfast Club and other, if you haven't spent 45 minutes interviewing Ali Sheedy, you don't know how long 45 minutes can be. I did get to interview, the two best interviews I had in my life was Jackie Gleason and Kirk Douglas, which I can tell you about later. Then you just cast about. And again, you say yes to everything at that stage in your life. I went to the Wall Street Journal, which the Wall Street Journal hired from the Big Ten. And they had an incredibly Midwestern and hence friendly atmosphere at the Wall Street Journal. And I have vivid memories of the niceness of the journal and the organizational culture there. Then I went to a Weekly Standard, the most enjoyable place I've ever worked, where it was a team of brothers and sisters. And it was all equals, all working together at a small magazine. And again, I don't scarcely remember the articles I wrote. I remember the people I worked with and the quality of those people. Then I got a job offer from the New York Times to write a biweekly column. And this is the least pleasant job I've ever had. That's not a joke. The New York Times has a corporate culture based on busyness and competition. So you actually don't hear gales of laughter erupting around the newsroom of the New York Times. I had a friend, before I went to join there, I had lunch with her, and I knew various people at the Times, and I said, "Oh, so I know so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so. They work at the Times." And she said, "Well, I don't know them yet, but I've only been here 10 years, so I haven't met that many people." And corporations have different atmospheres. And we have, for that reason, a bit of an aloof atmosphere. 2 times a week, writing a column turns out to be quite hard. I used to have all these normal human drives for hunger, for thirst, even for romance. Now I only have one drive. It's for column ideas. And so your job can suck you up in that way. And then finally, you write a certain length. 780 words is not a great length. But I'll probably do this for the rest of my life because I at least have the illusion that I'm serving some purpose in this job. And so even though it's unpleasant, you feel like your life has some meaning because the job has some purpose. And I think that's fundamentally what this conference is about. We live, as President Hatch mentioned, in a world famous, or a country famous for its workaholism. Americans are the hardest working people on the face of the earth. We now work more hours a year than the Japanese. The average American works 350 hours a year longer than the average European. That's 9 weeks a year longer than the average European. Seymour Martin Lipset, a great sociologist, noted that Americans are more likely to be workaholics than people from any other country. 6 in 10 Americans do work while on vacation. If you ask people around the world this question, do you agree with this question? I make a point of doing the best work even if it interferes with the rest of my life. 60% of Americans say that statement applies to them. 38% of Germans say the same thing, and Germans are hard workers. So we are a hard-working country. And for many people, especially in their 40s and 50s, life really funnels down to two things. It funnels down to work, and it funnels down to family. And frankly, the amount of time spent with friends and doing occupations or vocations they really like hiking or being outdoors, those things suffer. And most people make these trade-offs and are happy with these trade-offs. Many think that what we do when we work this hard is soul-destroying, that it impoverishes all our relationships. And I work in a profession where I observe politicians, and I have to say I do observe people whose lives are impoverished by the intense amount of work they do. I interviewed a member of Congress named Deborah Price from Columbus, Ohio recently, and she was telling me about her race, her latest congressional race. And what disgusted her about that race was not the ads that were run against her, which were viciously negative. They were the ads she had to run against her opponent, which were also viciously negative. Her mother came up to her and said, "I'm ashamed of you for running these ads." And again, these are the sorts of professional compromises people have to make if they want to get elected. You can't do good unless you win. And like journalism, politics involves certain professions or certain concessions. But the biggest concession that politics actually demands is that it demands people running for office talk constantly about themselves. There are some politicians who are liberals, some are conservatives, but the ideology of all politicians and many successful people is the ideology of meism. Talking about me, going into a room talking about me, meeting donors, are they for me or against me? Meeting journalists, will they write nice things about me or not nice things about me? Meeting with consultants who have discussions on how to package me. It becomes a form of narcissism, a form of extreme narcissism that no normal person can withstand. They suffer what I call logorrhea dementia, which is talking so much they drive themselves insane. And many surrender to this form of meism. They allow their authentic personhood to be bleached away, their idiosyncratic characters, their personal backgrounds. They become the product of this need to this need to brand and product themselves. They believe not what they think is true, but whatever is in their interest to believe. They become sort of simulated creatures. If you're in the room with them one-on-one, they talk at you like you're 1,000 people, like you're a big auditorium, because that is their only way they know how to deal with others. And that is the sort of compromise and soul compromise that politicians often get sucked into. John McCain actually doesn't have it. He has a private thought process. He'll say something in public which is half the truth, then he'll get back on the bus and he'll talk about what is really true in an off-the-record setting. And one of the reasons I admire McCain is because he still has that honest, true voice in there. Other politicians will try to do it, but they'll just say in private the exact thing they just said in public. They'll just throw in a few curse words because they've lost the ability to be honestly true to themselves. More recently, in response to the Eliot Spitzer problem, I wrote about something called the rank-link imbalance, which is people who spend all their time climbing. They have developed fantastic skills for dealing with people above them and people below them, but they're incredibly weak at dealing with people at their level, with true friends and true spouses. And what you see this people in politics also all the time. And what they do is they rise, they become successful since they're so good at achieving social rank, but then in midlife, they decide they're lonely, that the career profession has done nothing for their souls, and they become desperately lonely and they try to reach out. But they have no emotional skills in dealing with peers. And so they become like these sloppy St. Bernards, lunging and kissing often at women. And I wrote the line that when you'll see a senator or a politician in the midst of one of these midlife crises, and he'll want some emotional connection, and he'll be sitting at a perfectly fine dinner table, and suddenly a woman next to him will find a tongue in her ear because he is so crude and needy and uncontrolled. And I wrote that line in a column, and the number of emails I got from female Senate staffers was high, attesting And so these are all the qualities, the kind of corruptions and soul corruptions that can go into a profession, of being swallowed up in the need to brand yourself, swallowed up in the need to work hard and to climb. And yet I personally think there are ways, and I see it in the vast majority of people you meet, of ways of people who don't suffer from these maladies, who are able to work hard and nonetheless maintain their wholeness. And I'd just like to finish by talking about two qualities I think these people have. The first, they have anxiety. I was at the home of a very rich person out in Sonoma County, California, and he basically owned the vineyard, or owned the valley. He had a vineyard in this valley. You looked at his property, and it was really the whole valley. And he had a friend of mine over for dinner, and we were in this incredibly beautiful mansion drinking his wine. And he said to us at the end of the meal, you know, I've achieved success, but I haven't achieved significance. And later in the night, my friend said, as we were walking back to our guest cabins, he said, if my wife had been here in this valley, his valley, and heard him say that, she would have punched him right in the face. And yet that anxiety that he had is a real anxiety. And it's an anxiety for many successful people. And I think it's an anxiety that's deep in the American fabric. When people came to this country in early days, they saw these forests that went on forever. They saw these gigantic oysters. They saw flocks of geese that were so big it took them 45 minutes to take off. They saw the incredible abundance of America. And two thoughts entered their minds. The first was that God's plan for humanity could be realized here on this continent. And the second was that they could get really rich while doing it. And these two callings, material increase and salvation, have been interwoven in the American experience ever since. A great distinction that that occurs to people in other countries has been less common here in the United States, and that's the distinction between material and moral prosperity. Santayana said an American is an idealist working on matter. Cotton Mather famously said, we have these two callings, salvation and achievement, and these are the two oars we row in the boat to heaven. And so we've had this gospel of work, which has been half material and half moral. And it has this anxiety that we have to do both these things at once, I think has propelled the amazing work ethic I talked about. But it's also propelled a tremendous anxiety that we're letting down one side or another. And I would say this conference is a product of that anxiety. And it's been a product of Walt Whitman's writing, who celebrated work and worried about the spiritual effects. It's a product of Emerson's writing, who famously said, do your work and I shall know you. Do your work and you shall reinforce yourself. And so we have these two different sides of the American ethic and feel this intense need to do both. And I think fundamentally most Americans actually succeed. I am not one who believes that Americans' workaholism leads to social and emotional starvation in general. And I think there's very little evidence of that. Americans used to work many more hours than they did 30, 40 years ago than we do today. We've seen a constant decline in the number of hours worked. And yet the number of social connections measured by Robert Putnam was actually higher then than it is now. Some economists, Henry Safer and Karine Lumrad, studied number of hours worked, number of social connections, numbers of hours worked, number of organizational memberships. There's no evidence that people are working so hard they're decreasing the number of social connections. The people who work the hardest have the most social connections. You want something done, get a busy person to do it. And I think Abraham Lincoln exemplifies this ability to work phenomenally hard and still build up social connections. Lincoln was a poor boy in Ohio. Some visitors came and asked him to row them across the Ohio River. And he rowed them across. They threw some silver dollars into his boat to thank him for rowing them across the river. And he wrote of this episode, "You may think it was a very little thing, but it was a most important incident in my life. I could scarcely credit that I, a poor boy, had earned $1 in less than a day. The world seemed wider and fairer before me." And he was famously the one whose ambition knew no rest, famously a workaholic, but also famously moral and deep in his thinking about the world. And he exemplifies what I think most Americans actually achieve, which is the ability to work hard and also lead a full life. And so I think that anxiety that propels so many of us is a necessary product and a necessary thing that we all have to keep in our minds. The second and final thing I just wanted to talk about was self-transcendence. That the people who are happiest in their jobs are the ones who forget about themselves. One of my favorite books of recent years was written by somebody at Wake Forest, a man named Mark Leary, called The Curse of the Self. And he argues that the self, our sense of ourself, is both a blessing and a curse. The self is the way to define yourself, but for, I think, the happiest people, it's also a way to transcend themselves and forget about themselves. We all know the familiar ways people transcend themselves. One, through faith in God. Second, through loyalty and love through family. But through their jobs, you see people transcending themselves every day. They do it first by serving in a job that serves a larger mission. We've had this amazing explosion. As we've had a workaholic younger generation, we've had this amazing explosion of community service and social entrepreneurship. In many schools, 40 and 50% of the students are doing some sort of community service. I never tire of quoting the line of Steve Trachtenberg, the former president of GW University in Washington, who said of his students' community service, "I don't know where these kids find lepers, but they find them and they read to them," which is a great testimony to his. And if you go around the country, you find students who have gone to Teach for America, gone into AmeriCorps, and in communities all across the country, these people who call themselves social entrepreneurs. They got degrees from good universities. Maybe they went to Wall Street. Maybe they went to McKinsey. Maybe they went to Silicon Valley. But they tired of that, and they decided to fund or start a mentoring program, a program for teen parents. Maybe they went to Africa to deal with malaria. There was a revolution in the number of people doing this. And they have brought the values of business to their social entrepreneurship. And they are incredibly data-oriented, tiresomely so. Bill Gates came through Washington, had a dinner with journalists 2 weeks ago. And what struck me was he was totally uninterested in the political gossip we tried to offer him. But when asked which K-12 education programs lead to higher reading scores, he went on for half an hour with such incredible enthusiasm. And that is the sort of fire you now see among these social entrepreneurs, among people who are raised in this intense, high-achieving ethos. Sometimes I feel my generation has done our best to turn young people into narrow, workaholic achievatrons, but they've defeated our efforts to turn them into monsters by actually doing this community service. The second way people achieve transcendence at work is through the other people at their work, no matter what the profession is. And I tried to emphasize earlier when talking about myself that when I think back on the Wall Street Journal, the Weekly Standard, National Review, I barely remember what I wrote. But I do remember the people I worked with. Aristotle said we're social creatures, and he was only scratching the surface. We're bred and wired to have these intense connections with other people. And one of the things that always amazed me, Americans are asked, do you feel very satisfied at work? And for decade after decade, 80 or 90% of Americans say, yes, I feel very satisfied at work. I'm not sure they love the routines of their job, but they generally like the people they work with, or at least some small share of those people. And I think that's another way you lose yourself. You lose yourself in a social role. I always keep in my mind, as I'm covering politics, a list of people I admire more than all others in Washington, just to keep my faith in politics. And the list changes from month to month, but there are always some people who always stay on that list. George Shultz, a former Secretary of State, Robert Rubin, a former Secretary of the Treasury, Jim Lehrer, the host of the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. And they all have this in common. It's never about them. They have a role to perform. With Lehrer, who I know best of these men, Some shows are about the host. You're there to serve as foil to the host. With the Jim Lehrer NewsHour, it's never about the host. His questions are short. It's always about the subject matter. Some hosts, their questions are so long, you can go out to the men's room, come back, they're still answering the question. His questions are 3 and 4 words. And he never talks about himself, never throws himself into the story. He's performing that social role and losing himself in that role. And then the fourth and final way people can transcend themselves in jobs is through the craft, losing themselves in the difficulty of doing their craft. And Wake Forest is many things for me, but as people who've spent any time with me know, I'm a fanatical baseball fan. And I follow baseball, I follow college baseball. I went online to look at the statistics of the Wake Forest baseball team. Not the best year ever, but some great pitchers. I saw Ben Hunter, Charlie Mellies, I don't know how he pronounces his name, but some very fine pitchers. And at this time of year, I sometimes go back and look at a book which really exemplifies to me what craftsmanship is all about. It's a book by a guy named H.A. Dorfman called The Mental ABCs of Pitching. It's about pitching. And what Dorfman understands is we have in our heads this nursery school of faculties. We've got things that want to distract us. We've got little fights in parts of our minds. We've got people who want to go off and check email. And what Dorfman, like all craftsmen, does, he imposes self-discipline on the mind to focus it on one task. And he does it like the best people who organize craftsmen, not by shouting and saying you should be disciplined and you should have willpower. He does it by imposing order. In his order, he organizes the workplace. There's the pitcher's mound, and then there's everything else. He says when you're on the mound, you should only think about 3 things. What pitch am I going to throw? Where am I going to throw it? And where is the catcher's glove? If you think about anything else, step off the mound. And so immediately he's organizing thinking. He's getting all thought down to a craft and imposing structure. So there's off-the-mound thinking and mound thinking. On off-the-mound thinking, he wants his pitchers to be assertive. He believes in balance and measuring or regulating people's level of arousal. And the way you do that is get people moving forward. He wants the pitcher always to be challenging the hitter. Even on an 0-2 count, throw a pitch the batter will hit. The pitcher, he says, should welcome contact. And he should welcome contact because the pitcher's attention and arousal level should always be going forward as a way of disciplining the thought process. It should not be trying to avoid contact. It should always be moving forward with a sense of propulsion. And then throw the pitch, and then appraise the pitch. And he says the only thing you can understand about the pitch you threw is not whether it was a hit or not. That's beyond your control. The only thing you can control is how it left your fingers. And so do what you understand and appraise what you can control. Did the pitch go to the right spot? And what the batter did is totally immaterial to you because it's out of your control. And again, what he does is he builds a structure around a craft. And he narrows the focus of the pitcher onto the few things that really matter and the need for repetition and doing the same thing over and over and over again. And when you meet people who are at peak moments, whether on the pitching mound or whether they're corporate executives who do the same thing over and over again and do it extremely well, or whether they're writers or whether they're artists, they've always got this simple and highly repetitive process they've been doing all their lives. They do it over and over and over again, and in their obsession, in their unity with the task, they lose themselves. And there was a quote that actually Dorfman has in his book from an archery guy named Daisetsu Suzuki. And he says, the archer ceases to be conscious of himself as the one who is engaged in hitting the bullseye. And that's the ultimate statement of self-transcendence. So as President Hatch said, we have a culture that emphasizes the you-ness of you. It's all about you. It's marketing you. But to me, the core challenge of work is getting beyond you and losing yourself in the job, in the social role, in the people around you, in the mission. And that's the key and the core of why some people are corrupted by the jobs and other people are not. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dave, very much, David. Your remarks are always humorous and interesting and insightful. Let me now ask Steve Reinemund and Alex Sink to come forward. Steve is one of America's most successful business executives. He most recently led PepsiCo as chairman of the board and CEO. While he was there, he increased revenues by more than $9 billion and net income by more than 70%. Under his leadership, PepsiCo excelled in the nurturing of young leaders and the building of a diverse and inclusive culture. Steve currently serves on the board of directors for American Express, Exxon, Johnson & Johnson, and Marriott. Steve has a remarkably holistic view of leadership honed from his corporate and military experience, his business education, his faith, and his commitment to the common good. Welcome, Steve. Alex Sink is the Chief Financial Officer of the state of Florida, first elected in 2006. In the Department of Financial Services, she manages that budget of over $300 million and oversees over 3,000 employees. She also manages the state's treasury funds and licenses its insurance carriers. She comes to this position following a distinguished private career that included the presidency of Florida's largest bank, Bank of America. Alex is a graduate of Wake Forest University, the parent of a current first-year student, Lexi, and a member of our Board of Trustees. Alex is also the fire marshal of the state of Florida and might even show us her badge. Welcome, Alex. Steve and Alex are going to pose questions for David Brooks at this time.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for your comments. And I'll have the first question will be something very personal to me. I had a 26-year banking career, retired, decided that I wanted to continue to work and not be retired, so I entered public life as a politician. And you said some fairly interesting things about your observations about politicians. It makes me not want to not run for re-election, maybe. But oftentimes Tallahassee is our capital in Florida, and in my short 1.5 year in office, people will approach me and say things like, "You're a breath of fresh air, and you're different," and I feel good about that. And so, give me some advice. And hopefully we have other aspiring politicians amongst our students here in the audience about how do you, as a public official, stay true to yourself from your long observation of many, many famous politicians and not get into that speaking in sound bites and forgetting the core of who you are?
I would say, first, I tried to mention the challenges that go with being a politician, which Deborah Price had felt, and I'd mentioned Eliot Spitzer. And there is many people, especially at the super high levels who run for president especially, there's a level of high proportion of emotional freaks, I would say, of people who feel a need to dominate every route they enter. But there's also a high proportion of people who are earnest and in it for the public good. And I often tell people this, that the people in politics are more earnest and public-spirited than those of us who cover them, and that those of us who cover them are less cynical than voters. I believe that voters are actually more cynical than politicians. And when the times I've had an opportunity to observe a group of governors at a dinner table, they're not doing political strategy. They're talking about some computer program that saved their state $500,000 or something like that. They actually do care about governing. And we sit in the TV talk shows and do the analysis of what so-and-so must have been thinking when they made this move. And we have these strategies, well, they were thinking 6 yards down the road and doing this. And then inevitably you get the the person in a private setting and say, were you thinking of any of this? They say, no, it just came out accidentally. I wasn't thinking anything. And so I do think, and this is especially true in Congress and especially true in the House, the lives one leads are not that rewarding. There's a lot of incredible hard work. There's a lot of time away from home. There are a lot of sacrifices. And you just wouldn't do it. Unless you're a very cynical person, you wouldn't do it unless you felt you were serving the public good. And I feel that most are. And when I mentioned Deborah Price, she's someone who really cares about the public good, but has to win elections. And so she's a good person, put in an extremely demanding position, and still has the honesty to say, I'm ashamed of the ads I had to run. And how you feel about that, maybe she should stop running those ads. But you can't serve if you don't win. And so these are real-life complications that every profession has, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
David, it was fascinating. Before we came in, you were sharing some thoughts about your family, and you said something that really caught me. You said that you have 3 children, and that your 9-year-old actually wants to have you home, and your teenagers actually like you. Now, to me, that's fascinating. How have you been able to follow the demanding life that you follow and be able to have that kind of impact at home?
Well, this is a total cliche, but it happens to be true, and it's not selfless. The kids want to have fun all the time. That's what they're on Earth for. That's what they want to do. And so they're just more fun to be around than anybody else I know at work. And so I, needless to say, want to spend as much time as possible around them having fun and playing basketball, or, I'm 5'7", or doing whatever they want to do. It's just much more enjoyable. And I frankly find that true of most people. And I find if you want to get out of an event, just say, I want to spend time with your family. Everybody understands. I mean, the essence of, we're in a period where one of the major influences on public intellectual life is Darwin. And one of the things, the most humanistic thing that Darwinianism teaches is that all of us would die for our kids. And I think we would all do that, so people basically understand that. And I would say, going back to the subject of politics, one of the most chilling things for me is how many politicians, and this is certainly true in business and law and the professions, how many of them, and I think it's a percentage, but it's a freakishly large percentage, I'm not going to give a number, who spend so little time with their kids. And I once had a person who'd run for president and lost say to me, before you run for president, you ask yourself this question: am I willing to destroy the next generation of my family to do this? And so a lot of people say yes to that question. And it may be because they think they have to serve the country. And those who spend their time interviewing Nobel Peace Prize winners or humanitarians often say they're not very good to their family. They don't have a domestic bone in their body. They care about the common good, but not their family. Most normal people care about their family above everybody else. I would say I'm no different. And I do buy them everything they ask for. Which works for the boys. My girl is more complicated.
Can I just follow up on that then? This demanding schedule that we have placed in front of our national politicians in this election, is it possible for a balanced leader to have the kind of sort of materialistic moral balance that you talked about and be successful in this environment that we have in the national political scene?
I would say it's just a tremendous challenge for them not to want to publicize and therefore pollute every aspect of their lives. And I would say of the 3 remaining candidates, one of the things they all talk about, and I've heard McCain talk about this, is how do you use he is a boy in Iraq. Do you talk about that? When do you talk about it? And he never does, almost never does. He's asked. And I would say that the 3 remaining candidates have done a pretty good job. I think the Clintons did a fantastic job. And some of you may have seen on the news, Chelsea Clinton was asked about Monica Lewinsky for the first time, And she said, none of your business, which was the perfect answer as far as I'm concerned. There has to go back to Alex's question, there has to be this zone of reality. And the politicians who are still normal have a zone of reality of people they talk to and relate to in a normal way. Joe Biden ran for president, didn't do well, but he ran a great campaign. It's unjust. But one of the things, I was with him in Iowa, he had 23 family members with him. Extended family, many sisters, kids, grandkids. Sometimes it was half the audience was his family. But you saw an extended family, and I think Joe Biden's a wonderful man, in part because he carried that with him. With McCain, it's somewhat family, it's somewhat his army buddies. With Obama, it's the two daughters, and I recall interviewing him as he was trying to decide whether to run. And I said to him, if you were president, you'll spend a lot more time with your daughters than you will right now, because he was on the road campaigning all the time. But I do think it is something they all struggle with, and the three remaining have done extremely well. Some of the others, they just can't sit still, and they really don't know how to relate. If I can just make one other quick question. I mentioned my sons. I do these Sunday shows, like Meet the Press and Face the Nation, all that. You hate to be away from your kids on the weekend, so you bring your kids to the Sunday shows. And one of the great things about those shows is not being on the air, but the people they have the journalists on at the end and the newsmakers on in the beginning, and the newsmakers are stuck in a conference room or a green room with you and your kids for 45 minutes before we go on. And it's really interesting to see who relates well to my kids. And I developed this thing called the Joshua Rule. He's the name of my oldest son. Which politician is great with Joshua and which were incompetent with Joshua. And when Joshua was about 12, he was in a room twice with John Kerry. And John Kerry would make a good faith effort to relate to a 12-year-old. It was the most awkward thing you'd ever want to see. And I remember sitting there thinking, this guy is not going to be president. See, if you can't relate to a 12-year-old, you can't relate to the American people. So.
Well, your story reminds me that when I made the decision to run for office, I had to answer 3 questions. These are unusual. You'll find these unusual. Number 1, did I want the job? Because I view the job as work, not as an advancement for some political career or political agenda. Number 2, how would my family feel about it? And number 3 was, did I think I could win? Because I was going to have to ask people to give money and my friends to contribute to my campaign, and I didn't want them to invest in a failing effort. So when I asked my children what they thought about my running for office, they looked at each other. They were in high school. They looked at each other and said, and then looked back at me and said, "Mom, we don't care. We're not going to be around anyway." So sure enough, they're both in college. But that leads me to ask you a question about your commentary about the power of work in the context of social connections. Probably 10 or 15 years ago, with the advent of computers, we all thought there wouldn't be any office buildings occupied anymore, and maybe you had this experience at PepsiCo. Everybody can just work at home and set up their computers, and we don't need office space. But it seems that we've evolved back to that social interaction, that human need for social interaction. But oftentimes what I see in these teenagers, and maybe you have this experience with your kids, is they get married to their computers and their computer games. And we went through a period of time, at least with our son, that he would come home, go to his room, shut the door, and spend hours playing computer games and not really doing a lot of social interaction. So how do you think that the power of technology and the use of the internet impacts this very real need to have social interactions, the kind of thing that you experience at the Weekly Standard and your other places of business?
Right. Oh, well, that's a good question. I'd love to ask you about how you view fundraising, but we'll save that. I have a general view, which is the paperless office rule. When computer technology first became widespread, we thought we were going to have paperless offices. And for those of you who are in the paper industry know there's more paper consumed than ever before. And the rule is whatever we think will be the effect of technology, it's always the exact opposite. And we had a sense that people would grow less socially connected. And I think there's been some of that. Elaine Scotchpole, who's a sociologist somewhere in New England, maybe Boston College or Boston University, has pointed to the decline of a certain sort of social organization like Elks Clubs and Lions Lodges for people who are under 30 or 40 or 50. These were these gigantic organizations where people would go every week and they'd have a meeting and they'd do good works for the neighborhood and the community. And there were millions and millions of people involved in these organizations. And one of the great things about them was they were cross-class. There were rich people, there were poor people, and they all intermingled. Those organizations no longer exist. If you look at the organizations that are thriving, they tend to be within the same demographic groups. And so I think we have lost some of that, though I would say that's less the computer and more the television. And so to me, the computer has created this revolution in social networking, the Facebooks of the world, the eHarmonies. And one of the things we can do, and we can see how well people bond, and I think Facebook actually does, on balance, enrich social. Online dating is more complicated. What it does is it makes the things you can put on paper more, or on screen, more and more important. And people have now done these elaborate studies of who is successful on an online dating site. And the things that really matter, and you can tell, this really isn't a sore spot for me, I'm fine with my height, but 6-footers really matter. If you're not under 6, and in fact, people have done studies, basically, people are attracted to others who have status. And they have done studies, if a man who's 5'7" makes $175,000 a year more than the 6-footer, he is equal in social terms on online dating sites. And they've got these algorithms, how much more you have to make to be even. So people are really doing, I think, making their mating selections in very socially uncomfortable ways. But eventually they need to meet up, and this gets to the second part of your question, which is why we still have offices. Because online we can communicate in a certain number of ways. Our communication channels are like this thick, but face-to-face our communication channels are this thick. The amount of emotional cues we're sending to each other by looking at each other, by tone of voice, by body language are so much richer. There's a Princeton sociologist, or political scientist named Todorov, who gives voters a look at a candidate in another part of the country, just a photograph. He gives them this look, I think, for 1/1000th of a second, and then 5/1000th of a second. And based on people's glimpses for these very brief periods of time, he can predict with 70% accuracy which candidate is going to win an election. This is Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blank. People make incredibly rapid decisions about each other based on some face-to-face thing, and pretty good decisions. They've done this study in college campuses where they show students a professor for a very short period of time. They ask the students to write a little description of what they think of this person they've just seen. Then they compare them to the post-course evaluations. They match up. So we just have incredibly rich communications that are happening between all of us all the time. And that's why there's workplaces. And that's why there's Wall Street. I once asked somebody who's a trader on Lower Manhattan, why are you here? And he said, it's not for my current job, it's for my next job. I need to have face-to-face contact for the people who might hire me down the road. And I think that is the rewarding aspect of all work, the face-to-face contact and the slow accumulation of friendship.
Change subject just a little bit. Recently, you talked today about social entrepreneurs, and you wrote recently about the do-gooders and social entrepreneurs. How are those, how do you see social entrepreneurs as you describe them different than people who've been students and adults that have been socially conscious in the past? What's the distinction?
I would say there are generational changes. I think I went back and reread what it was like to be a young person in the New Deal in the 1930s. And the people who were New Dealers had the same sense of excitement. And they came to Washington, and they worked at committees, and they worked at the big granite buildings who are near where I live. And they had a sense that was the way they could really marshal federal energy to do good. And to some extent, they succeeded at that. And then there was another generation, the 60s generation, which had another vision of how one does good. I think I came to Washington in the 80s with the Reagan generation. I think that was another generation of people who had a certain conception of how you do good. Certainly the people who serve in the military have that same fervor. And I think these social entrepreneurs have just a different way of doing good. They're much more data-driven, as I mentioned. I find they're not hostile to government, but they're not particularly inspired by government. I think they're suspicious of bureaucracy. They like small. They've seen Silicon Valley, and in their mind, Silicon Valley is the model of how social organizations should work: loose, decentralized networks. And the things that strikes me is that this rise in community service is an absolutely organic thing that grew up with really admissions committees helped by requiring community service. But once it got going, it just got going. And now Teach for America is super hard to get into. And a lot of people want to do it. And I don't think it's a flash in the pan. You see these rises and falls of these movements, and I think this is a real thing, and I wish the politicians would see this, would leverage this, and try to scale it up into something bigger, because it hasn't scaled up. And the final thing to be said was one of the big mistakes of the Bush administration was not taking advantage of 9/11 to tap into this spirit. And it's just, I've noticed it covering the election, it's a gaping wound in the country that so much desire to serve has been untapped. And people want that.
Well, I'll brag on I agree. I'll brag on our school for a moment, Wake Forest. I may not have the numbers exactly right, but I believe that for the size of our school, we have more kids doing Teach for America and serving in the Peace Corps than almost any other institution of higher education. And the motto here is Pro Humanitate, and every student who goes to school here, I hope, is still instilled with that vision and spirit and sense of responsibility to serve humanity, which leads me to the next idea I'd like for you to explore with us and you alluded to it a little bit when you first came up here, is what about the issues of faith and spirituality when we think about how we approach work today? What are you observing in the American ethos today?
Well, one of the things we've seen, certainly on university campuses, has been this renaissance of faith on campuses. Not long ago, I interviewed the Princeton, I keep citing academics, but they actually know what they're talking about, Princeton sociologist of religion, Robert Wuthnow. And I said, you've been at Princeton for many years. What's one of the things you've noticed in the changes of your students? And he said, when I got here, for a student to admit that he or she was religious was like admitting you had acne. You just didn't want to do it. But now it's very open, and it's almost, people admire that quality. And I do think there has been a greater tolerance, and hence a greater renaissance of Bible study groups and religious commitment. And one of the things one notices is the way this commitment now interweaves the workplace, the Bible study groups, the openness about faith, and I think the general acceptance of faith in religion in workplaces. And what this does, and faith is its own subject, but I think what it does in the university and the workplace is it gives a language of character. One of the things we lack is a language to talk about honesty, virtue, sin, evil, words that used to have a meaning that people understood and sort of didn't have a meaning. The great philosopher Alistair MacIntyre says, we're like people who are living in an age where we have words like gravity, but we no longer know what those words mean. But we have words like evil and sin, but we don't quite know what they mean anymore. And I think faith provides you, aside from everything else, provides you with that language. One of the things that's disturbed a lot of people about some universities is that they teach students how to get into professional school, how to get good grades. But on the subject of character, they think it's not their job to do character formation. So they micromanage students' lives in every aspect except the most important, and then they say, well, you're on your own. Figure it out. Figure out what good character is. I think faith is the thing as people are hungry for these ultimate questions, that's what they go to. And I would say this is somewhat controversial, but if you look at the studies of people with faith and without faith, how they do at work, how they do in marital rates, obesity rates, if you want to put it in utilitarian terms, it works. People who are church attendees tend to have much lower marriage rates, though not as low. They have equal divorce rates, but that's a separate issue. They tend to work harder, tend to have all sorts of positive things correlate with it. And I think it is because there's a moral language and a level of moral discipline that one is at least reminded of once a week.
You talked about the growth of the meism, if you put it that way. How does that, is that the momentum that you see, and how does that contrast to this whole idea of social entrepreneurs and, the importance of this balance that you talk about that you see happening more and more on the college campus? Are they working together? Is there a momentum more one way than another, or how do you see that?
I guess I would say people learn. There was a great book called Habits of the Heart by Robert Bellah and others in the 1970s, which was about people really focusing on themselves and coming up with the idea that truth was something they had inside themselves. They just had to dig down and they'd find truth. And one of the famous characters in that book was a woman named Sheila, who didn't ascribe to any organized religion, but she picked little pieces of various religions she liked, and she put it together into a religion she called Sheilaism. And that's an ethos that emphasizes you. The biggest bestseller, maybe in America of any sort, the last 20 years is Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Life. And what's the first sentence of that? It's not about you. Mm-hmm. And people try one thing and they try another. And I think that sense, it's not about you, is a rising sense and a true verity. And that's one of the things I tried to underline. But we fight this war at. I know you served. I don't know what branch of the military you served in.
Marine Corps.
Marine Corps. Well, see, there it really isn't about you.
Mm-hmm.
But we had this slogan, "An Army of One," and some people thought that was appealing to the more self-interested nature of the possible recruits. And I thought that was a mistake. When people join the military, they want to serve a cause larger than themselves. And just because of what you said, I mentioned Jim Lehrer as one of the people I admire of all time in Washington. Many of you may watch him. I do the segment with he and a guy named Mark Shields, and they were both Marines, or are both Marines. And they've done many things in their lives. There's nothing that they've done in their life that is as important to them as their service in the Marine Corps. They bitch and moan about it, but you can see it's at the core of their being. And one day we were doing a show in the early days of the Iraq War, and the segment before us was about a funeral of a Marine. And Lehrer started weeping. And it's live TV, so they cut to Lehrer. He blurted out one question. Shields answered for about 5 minutes. I answered for about 5 minutes. We ate up the entire segment because they could not cut back to Lehrer because he just had tears coming down his cheeks, and he was dabbing it with tissues. And that commitment to the Marine Corps is something that's so impressive for those of us who weren't in it to see. And I also mentioned George Shultz, former Secretary of State and Treasury and almost everything else, labor. If you go to his office at Stanford, you see these Marine Corps posters everywhere. You might see a little thing that reminds you that he was Secretary of State, but by God, you know he was a Marine. And that commitment to that cause is so large in these people that if you ever need a reminder of service to something else, that's it.
I'd like to, last one, I'd like to ask you a question about the notion of thinking time. In my office the other day, we were in our usual frenzy, and I I sense that when I look at other people as well as myself, is that we spend enormous amounts of hours working, worrying about our work life. You can't even walk from Waite Chapel to Renolda Hall without looking at your blackjack or your BlackBerry or answering your cell phone, and walking through the airports, observing people who are texting, sending emails, got their computers out. And it frustrates me and worries me somewhat that Americans are not setting aside that important time to be reflective and to actually think strategically about either their work or their own personal lives. And I would assume that you, in your craft as a journalist, you have to have think time, but maybe you don't. What are you observing from people that...
My readers are convinced I don't. But,
Have you likewise observation in all the many people from different walks of life that you come across that if there's one downfall, we're not setting it, we're just being intrusive about emails and text messages and.
Yeah. When I go to stop in the gas station, and I know it's going to take me 2 minutes for the gas to go into the tank, I figure I can get 5 emails done in that time I'm out there. And you go to the airplane, and you see people. There's certain sort of people who are coming down the aisle, and they know they're going to have to turn off their phone when the door closes. So they're talking to get those last few seconds of cell phone time, and it's like when their door closes, they're going to cut off their trachea. They're going to, and I always say, what are they actually talking about? You hear them. What they're doing is they're narrating their own life. So they'll say, yeah, I'm on a plane, I'm heading for Chicago. And you imagine the person on the other end saying, yeah, I'm driving by the hardware store. So it's not even necessary. They just need to be that connected. I do think that is a real problem. Yeah. And most good thinking happens happenstance by incubation. It just comes at you. And I do think, and one of the things I like about H.A. Dorfman, the pitching guy, is that he does set aside, he focuses attention on things. And I think many of us, and certainly me, find it phenomenally hard to focus because there's always the BlackBerry. The computer screen is so easy to toggle over to something else. And
even when you're on vacation, well, why can't you be on the conference call? Or why can't you call me? Or why can't you answer my email?
Or even to slow down your brain so you can think, okay, I'm sitting for an hour, fine. And it's hard to do. So I agree that's a very legitimate problem we have not dealt with. Just before we close, I feel compelled to say that I am, of course, the biggest hypocrite on earth since I've been talking about self-transcendence while talking a lot. And I feel a little embarrassed. I went into journalism because I would get a chance to interview people like you guys. It's a little weird to be interviewed by.
But, it's great, we love it.
But anyway, I just appreciate it. I feel a little awkward that the roles are reversed, but I do appreciate it and hope to hear from you guys.
Good.
And thank you, President.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, Alex, and Steve, for a wonderful introduction to the complex themes that we'll wrestle with all day tomorrow. Let me invite all of you to those respective sessions, which you'll find in your program. Let me thank all of you for being here. Let me thank those other participants, distinguished set of leaders and scholars who will be with us tomorrow. And I want to offer a particular word of thanks to the deans of our professional schools who have been instrumental in the planning and execution of this conference. Bill Applegate, our Dean of Medicine, Jack Wilkerson, Dean of the Callaway School, Ajay Patel, Dean of the Babcock School, Blake Morant, Dean of our Law School, and Bill Leonard, our Dean of Divinity. Again, let me thank all of you for coming today, and good afternoon.